It all began with the sound. But it wasn't an ordinary sound. It didn't vibrate in the air, nor could it be picked up by sensors. It was a subtle noise that slipped directly into the mind, an echo that seemed to have crossed the very fabric of space-time. On the surface of the human colony of Erebus, people woke up in the middle of the night with the same unsettling feeling. The world around them was wrong. The starry sky looked identical, but something was hidden behind it, something no one could describe. The strangest part? Everyone started having the same memory of an event that never happened. And, thousands of light years away on the aquatic planet Nyra, the Nereians were experiencing the exact same phenomenon. For the humans, the memories were confusing fragments. A submerged planet, conversations with beings with luminous eyes, and the undeniable feeling that they knew these creatures. For the Nereians, it was even worse. Accustomed to an almost perfect collective consciousness, the emergence of alien thoughts, human ones specifically, was a nightmare that threatened their very identity. Rellak, one of Nyra's oldest mentors, began seeing flashes of a city called Erebus and of a man he had never met but whose name he now couldn't forget, Isaac Voss. The problem was that, at that exact moment, Dr. Isaac Voss on Earth was having vivid dreams about an alien with luminous eyes named Rellak. When the first communications were exchanged, there was no immediate shock or fear. The real terror emerged when they realized they were sharing memories that shouldn't exist. No human ship had ever reached Nyra. No Nereian had ever been to Earth. And yet, both species had detailed mental records of interactions, events, and even feelings that seemed genuine. It was as if their histories had been rewritten without their knowledge. To try to understand what was happening, humans and Nereians traced the origins of these memories. That's when they found the first sign. A gravitational anomaly in the Valorum system, the same place that kept appearing in their visions. The Aletheia, an exploration ship equipped with both human and Nereian technology, was sent to investigate. Isaac and Rellak, still wary of each other, were chosen to lead the mission. It wasn't a choice made out of trust but out of necessity. Both knew that what was at stake wasn't just the truth behind the memories, but something much greater, the integrity of reality itself. What they didn't know, however, was that the phenomenon wasn't a mistake or a cosmic accident. It was deliberate, a key to a mystery that would challenge not only their beliefs but their very identities. And the real question that began to form in their minds was, what if these memories weren't false? What if they were forgotten? When the Aletheia entered hyperspace, crossing the known boundaries of the universe toward Valorum, the first signs that something was deeply wrong began to appear. Instruments malfunctioned randomly, and time inside the ship seemed to flow irregularly. Hours turned into minutes, while seconds dragged on for days. Isaac found objects in places he didn't remember leaving them, while Rellak began speaking in a language no Nereian recognized, but humans understood perfectly. It was as if the universe itself was folding around them, preparing them for something they couldn't avoid. What they would find in Valorum wouldn't just be an answer. It would be the beginning of a dilemma that would change the course of their civilizations forever. The space around the Aletheia seemed normal, until it didn't. As they approached the gravitational anomaly in Valorum, the black void of the cosmos began to show fractures, not physical ones, but perceptible in the minds of the crew. It was as if space itself were splintering, revealing hidden layers of a reality that had always been there but never seen. The stars blinked out of sync, as if dancing to a song only the universe knew. Isaac felt a weight in his chest, an anxiety he couldn't explain. Rellak, on the other hand, remained silent, his eyes fixed on a point in the infinite, as if he already knew what they were about to find. The first direct impact hit the crew. Lieutenant Marla Ruiz, the communications officer, began reciting coordinates in a language no one recognized, except Rellak, who identified it as an ancient variant of the Nereian language, extinct for millennia. The problem? Marla had never left Earth and certainly had no knowledge of archaic alien languages. Other crew members reported constant feelings of déjà vu, memories of missions they had never undertaken, and conversations with people they had never met. It was as if the Aletheia was traversing not just space but the very memories of the universe. Isaac and Rellak began to notice that their personal connections to the phenomenon were deeper than anyone else's. Isaac found personal data files on his terminal that he had never written, journals describing encounters with Rellak on past missions that never happened. Rellak, in turn, began having visions of a hybrid daughter, part human, part Nerian, with eyes that glowed like collapsing stars. These visions weren't just hallucinations. They were vivid, charged with emotion, as if they were real memories from a life they had both lived somewhere at some point. Upon entering Valorum's orbit, the Alethea detected the source of the anomaly, a colossal structure floating in space, shrouded in a gravitational field that distorted time around it. There was no record of this construction in any human or Nerian database, and yet both Isaac and Rellak felt an odd familiarity with the structure. It was as if they had been there before, though they knew that was impossible. The Alethea itself began reacting to the proximity of the structure. Navigation systems failed, and temporal readings showed conflicting dates. Some instruments indicated they were in the future, others in the past. As the ship stabilized its orbit, an unidentified transmission began coming through. It was an encrypted message, but what shocked everyone was the transmission signature. Dr. Isaac Voss and Mentor Rellak. The problem? The message was old, dated 200 years before the Aletheus mission. It didn't make sense. Isaac and Rellak were alive and well, leading the mission at that exact moment. How could they have sent a message from the past? When they decoded the transmission, confusion turned to terror. The message was a warning. Do not enter. What's inside will change who you are. Time is not what it seems. We tried. We failed. Panic swept through the crew. What did the message mean? Were they trapped in a time loop, repeating the same mistakes without knowing? Isaac and Rellak, however, knew they had no choice. Ignoring the anomaly meant leaving the mystery unsolved, but entering could cost them their very identities. It was the perfect dilemma. The human and Nerian desire to explore the unknown versus the existential risk of losing everything they were. Even with the crew divided, the decision was made. Isaac and Rellak would lead an expedition to the structure. They needed to understand what was happening, and, more importantly, why they themselves were at the center of this enigma. With pressurized suits and pounding hearts, Isaac, Rellak, and a team of scientists crossed the space between the ship and the structure. With each meter they approached, time seemed to slow, and voices over the communicator became more distorted. Upon entering, what they found wasn't just advanced alien technology. They stumbled upon something impossible. A room filled with versions of themselves, frozen in time, each in different stages of life and death. What was this structure? A temporal laboratory? A graveyard of alternate realities? The only certainty was that the answer was closer than ever, and it might be something none of them were prepared to face. The structure surrounded them like a living labyrinth. The metallic walls pulsed with an energy that seemed tuned to their very minds, reflecting not just their images but their most intimate thoughts. Time inside wasn't a straight line. It was a broken circle, where past, present, and future coexisted in a chaotic dance. Isaac felt the weight of this distortion, as if every step he took was also a deeper plunge into alternative versions of himself. Rellak, whose mind was accustomed to the symbiosis of the Nerian collective consciousness, began to feel an internal rupture, a separation of his identity that threatened to shatter him. At the heart of the structure, they found the node, a translucent sphere floating above a platform. It was the epicenter of the temporal distortion, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed synchronized with their heartbeats. The most disturbing part was that both Isaac and Rellak recognized the node immediately, even though they had never seen it before. Isaac had an instant vision, himself activating the node, followed by a stellar collapse that wiped out entire civilizations. Rellak saw a reality where humans and Nerians had merged into a single collective consciousness, losing their individualities completely. Both recoiled, terrified. The node wasn't just a source of energy, it was a catalyst of destinies. As they tried to understand how the node functioned, the structure began reacting to their presence. The walls vibrated with voices, some recognizable, others entirely alien. But the most terrifying moment came when they heard their own voices, from different points in time, conversing, screaming, begging them to stop. It was as if the node were alive, feeding on the infinite possibilities of their choices. Isaac found a recording on the structure's console, dated from a future that hadn't happened yet. We thought we could control it. We couldn't. There's no control here, only the cycle. Leave while you're still yourself. Rellak, despite his growing fear, attempted to establish a telepathic connection with the node, using his natural ability to integrate with the Nerian collective consciousness. What he found, however, wasn't a traditional alien intelligence. The node contained fragments of billions of consciousnesses, human, Nerian, and from other unknown species, all trapped in an endless cycle of repetition and failure. These consciousnesses weren't just imprisoned. They were aware of their imprisonment. And worse, some of them were beginning to merge with Rellak's mind, threatening to erase his original identity. Desperate to help Rellak, Isaac discovered that the node was, in fact, trying to create a bridge between alternate realities. Every activation of the node in any timeline created branches that inevitably led to a complete fusion of the consciousnesses involved. The cycle wasn't a glitch, it was the node's purpose. But why? It was a question no one could answer. Maybe it was a flaw in the technology of the civilization that built the structure, or perhaps it was a deliberate attempt to transcend the limitations of time and identity. With time running out and the node's influence growing, Isaac proposed a desperate solution. Interact with the node not to destroy it, but to rewrite its functions. They couldn't simply shut it down, as that could collapse all interconnected realities. Instead, they needed to find a way to allow the consciousnesses to coexist without complete fusion. It was a risky move. Rellak, struggling to maintain his sanity, reluctantly agreed. They knew they were about to redefine not just the future of their species, but the very concept of existence in the universe. Connecting to the node, Isaac and Rellak were immediately thrust into a storm of visions. They saw worlds being born and dying, civilizations evolving and self-destructing, and versions of themselves in every possible state. Alive, dead, merged, separate. At the center of it all, there was a choice. Accept the cycle and merge with the other consciousnesses, or find a new way to exist, something that had never been attempted before. The answer didn't come from theories or technology, but from a simple human and Nerian understanding. Strength lay in the ability to embrace the unknown without losing the essence of who they were. With this realization, they reprogrammed the node, redefining the rules of the temporal paradox. When Isaac and Rellak disconnected from the node, time inside the structure seemed to have stopped. But the universe around them was far from static. The Aletheia, which should have been waiting in orbit, had vanished without a trace. The silence was absolute, but far from comforting. They knew they were no longer in the same point of reality from which they had departed. Something had changed not just within the structure, but across the entire cosmos. The sky visible through the openings in the structure was wrong. Unknown constellations filled the space, and the void felt denser, as if the very fabric of the universe was under strain. Trying to track the Aletheia, Isaac and Rellak activated one of the structure's consoles. But instead of navigation data, what appeared on the screen was a series of cryptic messages. They were dialogues between alternate versions of themselves, debating decisions they hadn't yet made. Each line of text felt like an echo of choices made in other timelines, some leading to survival, others to complete annihilation. But what stood out the most was a single phrase repeated in all versions. The true frontier isn't space. It's our own consciousness. This confirmed what both of them feared. They were facing not just a physical phenomenon, but an existential rupture. As they explored the structure in search of answers, they found a corridor that seemed to stretch infinitely. The strange part was that as they advanced, they began to see fragments of their own lives projected on the walls, moments from childhood, scientific discoveries, personal losses. But something was off in these fragments. Some memories were distorted, as if they belonged to versions of themselves who had made different choices. Isaac saw a version of himself that had never left Earth, living an ordinary life, while Rellak saw a future where he led a Nerian faction declaring war on humans. Each step brought them closer to understanding that their identities weren't as fixed as they once believed. At the end of the corridor, they found a translucent door, pulsing with the same energy as the node. On the other side, they could see future versions of themselves, calmly observing them. It was an inevitable confrontation. Opening that door meant facing what they could become, depending on the choices they were about to make. But ignoring it would mean running from a truth that had already begun to corrode their minds. Isaac hesitated, but Rellak, with a determined look, took the first step. They knew they weren't just crossing a physical barrier. They were about to cross the frontier between who they were and who they might become. Inside the room, time had no meaning. The future versions of Isaac and Rellak stared at them with neutral expressions, as if they already knew every move they would make. The conversation that followed wasn't linear. It was an exchange of thoughts, memories, and feelings that transcended language. They learned that each cycle of interaction with the node created new realities, but all of them eventually led to a complete fusion of consciousnesses. The future versions explained that they had tried to resist, to rewrite the rules, but they always ended up absorbed by the paradox. The only path left untried was to embrace complete uncertainty, to allow realities to coexist without trying to control or separate them. Isaac and Rellak understood what they needed to do, but the task seemed impossible. They would have to disconnect from the need for definitive answers, accepting that the coexistence of multiple realities was the natural state of the universe. It was a rejection of the very scientific instinct to understand and categorize. But there was a risk. By doing so, they might completely lose their sense of identity, becoming just another thread in the cosmic fabric. It was a leap of faith, something no civilization, human or Nerian, had ever considered. But the alternative was worse, the eternal perpetuation of the cycle of destruction and fusion. With their decision made, Isaac and Rellak approached the center of the room, where a smaller replica of the node floated. They extended their hands, not to control or destroy, but to free the flow of realities. The impact was immediate. The structure began to dematerialize, not in an explosion, but as if it were being absorbed back into the fabric of the universe. Their future versions smiled, as if finally witnessing something different unfold. Isaac and Rellak felt their minds expand, not to merge, but to briefly touch all possibilities before returning to the present. When they opened their eyes again, they were back on the Aletheia, but they knew the universe would never be the same. The Aletheia was exactly where it was supposed to be, but nothing else felt familiar. The space around them seemed to have rebuilt itself, but with small, unsettling differences. Stars that had never been mapped shone in unfamiliar constellations. Planets once barren now emitted signs of life. But the most disturbing moment came when the ship tried to reconnect to the Erebus colony's communication network. The response came from an Earth that didn't exist in their records, an Earth calling itself Terra Prime, with a colonization history none of the crew recognized. Isaac and Rellak knew that the balance they had tried to restore hadn't brought the universe back to its original state. They were in a hybrid reality, an imperfect fusion of multiple timelines. As they tried to understand what had happened, the crew began exhibiting strange behaviors. Some members, like Lieutenant Marla Ruiz, reported memories of lives they had never lived, children they never had, missions to planets they'd never visited. Others began experiencing identity lapses, shifting between different personalities as if they were sharing mental space with alternate versions of themselves. Rellak, whose connection to the Nerian collective consciousness had always been solid, felt his mind fragment even further. He began perceiving thoughts that weren't just his own, but from Nerians who had never existed in his original reality. The situation worsened when they received a transmission from Terra Prime. The message was simple but filled with desperation. The temporal flow is unstable. You started this. Now you need to find a way to stabilize it before everything collapses. What disturbed them most was that the message seemed specifically directed at Isaac and Rellak, as if, in every reality, they were always the convergence point of the paradox. The dilemma was no longer just existential, it was practical. They had broken the cycle, but now they had to deal with the consequences of a universe where multiple realities coexisted in an unstable state. As they devised a plan to handle the instability, Isaac noticed something deeply unsettling. The realities were beginning to compete with each other. Places and people from different timelines started appearing and disappearing randomly, as if the universe itself were trying to decide which version should prevail. It was as if nature was attempting to correct what they had done by eliminating the versions that didn't fit into the new balance. This brought forth a terrifying possibility. What if they themselves were versions the universe decided to erase? Isaac and Rellak realized that the only way to restore stability was to find the origin point of the paradox, the exact moment when the cycle began, before they even knew about the structure in Valorum. But there was a problem. The very concept of origin was distorted. In a universe where time wasn't linear, how could they go back to the beginning? They would need to use the node in a way they had never considered before, not to travel through time, but to access the very fabric of reality and identify the moment when everything began to unravel. With the crew becoming increasingly unstable and time running out, Isaac and Rellak activated the node one final time. This time, they weren't led to visions of alternate futures or versions of themselves. Instead, they were confronted with a cosmic consciousness, the very essence of the paradox. This entity, which seemed to be the sum of all versions of themselves and other beings who had interacted with the node, explained that the cycle could never be completely eliminated. The paradox was a fundamental part of the universe's structure, and the only real choice they had was deciding how to live within it. With this revelation, Isaac and Rellak understood they couldn't simply fix the universe. Instead, they needed to accept the coexistence of realities and find a way to maintain a dynamic balance between them. Back on the Alethea, they transmitted this new understanding to Terra Prime and Naira, proposing an alliance not based on power or control, but on interdimensional cooperation. It was a new kind of diplomacy, one that recognized the universe was now a mosaic of infinite possibilities. The future wouldn't be a straight line but a constantly evolving web, and they would be the guardians of this new reality. The new reality that Isaac and Rellak helped create was far from stable. The multiverse now coexisted in a state of dynamic balance, but the very act of maintaining that coexistence generated invisible tensions. Small interdimensional fissures began to appear at random points in spacetime, where divergent realities briefly collided before separating again. In some cases, these collisions caused only subtle temporal distortions, but in others, they created dangerous anomalies, places where different laws of physics competed for dominance, threatening to destroy everything around them. The Alethea had become not just a ship of exploration, but one of interdimensional containment. The crew's mission was now to identify and stabilize these fissures before they grew too large. On one of these missions, Isaac and Rellak encountered an especially unsettling anomaly. An entire city from Naira had appeared on Earth, fused with a human metropolis. The two populations coexisted physically, but their realities were misaligned. People experienced time lapses, and objects disappeared and reappeared in altered states. It was as if the very fabric of reality was trying to decide which version to maintain, or whether it should attempt to merge the two permanently. While investigating the fused city, Isaac and Rellak found something even more disturbing: fragments of themselves. Parts of their consciousness, seemingly disconnected, roamed the city, interacting with people in ways neither Isaac nor Rellak could remember or control. These fragmented versions weren't just remnants of alternate realities. They were conscious, with wills of their own. They didn't want to be reintegrated. They wanted to exist independently. This raised a new and terrifying question. To what extent was the multiplicity of their versions sustainable? Would these versions be allies or enemies in the quest for balance? The attempt to reintegrate these fragments into the primary consciousness revealed a deep ethical dilemma. Each fragment had its own experiences, memories, and feelings. Erasing them would be akin to killing a conscious life. But allowing them to exist freely could further destabilize the fabric of reality. Isaac, confronted with a version of himself who had chosen a peaceful life over scientific exploration, hesitated. Rellak faced a version of himself who had rejected the Nerian collective consciousness, embracing complete isolation. The dilemma was no longer about the temporal paradox but about the right to existence of these new consciousnesses. As they wrestled with this impasse, a new threat emerged. An unknown force, taking advantage of the interdimensional fissures, began manipulating these anomalies for its own purposes. It wasn't an alien race or any known artificial intelligence. It was something that existed between realities, an entity formed from the very inconsistencies of the multiverse. This force began assimilating fragmented versions of beings from different realities, growing in power and threatening to collapse all dimensions into a single chaotic existence. Isaac and Rellak realized they weren't just dealing with the consequences of their choices, but with a new adversary born directly from the paradox they had unleashed. With the threat escalating, Isaac proposed a radical solution: temporarily merge their consciousnesses with the fragmented versions to gain enough knowledge and strength to confront the entity. Rellak, despite his reluctance, agreed, recognizing that this might be their only chance to restore balance. The process was risky and painful. During the fusion, both experienced an avalanche of memories and emotions from all their alternate versions, forcing them to confront all their failures, fears, and regrets. But they also discovered something unexpected, a collective wisdom that could be the key to defeating the interdimensional entity. The battle that followed wasn't fought with weapons, but with willpower and consciousness. Isaac and Rellak, now connected to a vast network of versions of themselves, confronted the entity in its own domain, the space between realities. By combining the knowledge of all their versions, they managed to isolate and contain the entity, not destroying it, but stabilizing its existence so it could no longer cause harm. When the fusion was undone, Isaac and Rellak returned to the Aletheia transformed. They were no longer just individuals from a single timeline, they were guardians of infinite possibilities, aware that the universe would always be in flux, and that the true challenge would be maintaining balance without losing themselves. The defeat of the interdimensional entity didn't bring the peace Isaac and Rellak had hoped for. The multiverse was stable, but only on the surface. They had contained the threat, but they knew the balance was temporary. The fissures between realities continued to emerge, bringing with them new versions of themselves and other beings, each carrying their own stories and dilemmas. The paradox was no longer just a flaw or a cycle. It had become an intrinsic part of the universe, something that couldn't be solved, only managed. The Aletheia, once a vessel of exploration, was now an outpost, an anchor navigating the chaotic currents of the multiverse. Back on Terra Prime and Naira, the effects of the paradox were felt at every level. Humans and Nereians began developing new forms of perception, capable of understanding and interacting with multiple layers of reality simultaneously. The concept of identity became fluid. People now recognized that parts of themselves existed in other realities, living completely different lives. For some, this was liberating. For others, deeply destabilizing. The boundary between the self and the other grew increasingly blurred. Isaac and Rellak saw this as the next step in evolution, but also as a new philosophical battleground. As the worlds adapted, a new message emerged. It wasn't from Terra Prime or any known civilization. The transmission seemed to come from outside the multiverse itself, from a reality that had yet to be discovered or created. The message was clear and unsettling. You haven't ended the cycle. You've only opened the next phase. Prepare for what's coming. Isaac and Rellak immediately understood what this meant. The entity they had contained was merely a fragment of something greater, a shadow of a force operating beyond their comprehension. The paradox wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a much more complex cosmic structure. Faced with this new threat, Isaac and Rellak felt no fear, only a resolute acceptance. They had become something more than mere explorers or scientists. They were now curators of the multiverse, guardians of the frontiers that separated, and sometimes united, divergent realities. They knew there would never be a moment of rest, that every stabilized fissure could spark a new instability elsewhere. But they also knew they weren't alone. The fragmented versions of themselves, once seen as threats, had now become allies in this eternal mission to maintain balance. They were no longer just Isaac and Rellak, they were all the Isaacs and Rellaks that had ever existed or could exist. As the Aletheia prepared to head toward the new call, Isaac gazed at the vast sea of stars, each one representing an infinite possibility. The universe wasn't a problem to be solved, but an eternal mystery to be explored. The paradox wasn't the end, but the beginning of a journey with no final destination. And as the ship disappeared into hyperspace, leaving behind what they knew and diving into the unknown, it became clear that the true mission wasn't simply to protect the multiverse. It was to understand that uncertainty was the greatest truth of the cosmos. They weren't just navigating space. They were navigating the very concept of existence.